Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum Jamian. Thank you so much, Junaidul Islam, and all the organizers of this event, and all of you for the gift of your time to be here today. This is my first time sort of officially or more formally addressing audiences in Bangladesh. So it's a matter of tremendous honor, privilege, and delight for me to be speaking with you. And I do want to also uh, pay my tribute to the martyrs, especially of July 2024 and all other uh, activists and freedom strivers who have brought about a tremendous and tremendously important political change in getting rid of a kleptocracy that we, of course, see in many different Muslim societies today. And I really am pleased and honored that you are so seriously invested in the intellectual tradition of South Asian Islam. And I've always believed that the resources and the complexities of Muslim intellectual tradition, broadly speaking, but then especially in the context of South Asia, is so rich, is so sophisticated, that it provides us with many resources and avenues for political thought and action. And it would be to our own peril to ignore or to treat with indifference this heritage of South Asian Islam. So let me take a few minutes just describing to you, taking a step back and describing to you sort of the main argument and the main purpose of this book, Perilous Intimacies, debating Hindu-Muslim friendship after empire. And then I'll maybe share with you an illustration or a case study of the argument, and then we can open it up for questions. So I think a good place to begin in terms of talking about this book might be its title, Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire. So one of the things that is very important to me and sort of the big picture thing with which I want to begin is that in order to really address the problem of Islamophobia, the problem of anti-Muslim racism in South Asia or beyond, one of the things that must be done is to look at the complexity and the details of intra-Muslim debates and contestations. The intra-Muslim scholarly or non-scholarly for that matter, debates and contestations are what make visible the dynamicity of Islam and the dynamicity of the Muslim intellectual tradition. And the importance of highlighting and studying and looking at the depth of intra-Muslim debates and contestations is that by highlighting this dynamicity, you are then able to undermine and critique any attempt by the modern state, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, or by other actors in society, to pigeonhole Islam and Muslims into particular compartments or particular boxes. That so and so is an extremist, so and so is a moderate, so and so is tolerant, so and so is intolerant, so and so is exclusivist, so and so is inclusivist. Now, I'm not saying that these categories may have no utility or no purpose whatsoever, but when we compartmentalize Muslims, scholars or non-scholars, into these easily digestible, categories and compartments, that does tremendous violence to the complexity, to the depth, and to the sophistication of the Islamic intellectual tradition heritage. So that sort of liberal secular desire to compartmentalize Muslims into easily digestible and easily understandable boxes, that critiquing this kind of an attitude in some ways is among the major purposes of my scholarship. And that I try to do by looking at intra-Muslim debates on different questions of ethical and theological significance. So in this book, I'm interested in looking at this theme through intra-Muslim debates on the idea of inter-religious friendship, and specifically Hindu-Muslim friendship, from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century. That's the time period in which I'm looking at this phenomenon. And what I mean by the word perilous intimacies is this. The word friendship is quite interesting because the idea of friendship um, has this kind of a dual property, a dual kind of quality, in that a relationship of friendship can promise, the highest forms of virtue, all kinds of spiritual and worldly benefits, and opportunities for the expansion and enrichment of the self. But at the same time, if one becomes blindingly bound to a harmful friend who has a harmful effect on our practice, on our behavior, then friendship can also be very perilous. So friendship is both a promise and and a peril. Uh, and interestingly, if you look at this is some way in which in Western philosophy also, right from Aristotle onward to someone as recent as the French theorist Jacques Derrida, they have looked at friendship as this kind of a quality which has this dual quality. It is a promise of accessing the other and enriching the self, of um, making the self more virtuous. But then the self can also be very badly damaged or harmed or even eviscerated in the company or in the entanglement of a harmful friend. So friendship as both a promise and a peril. Now, interestingly, if you look at the Muslim intellectual tradition, so this is in some ways Western philosophy and how friendship has been talked about in some major strands of Western philosophical reflections on the idea of friendship. When we look at the Muslim intellectual tradition, there is something quite similar but also different happening. The category for friendship that is invoked most frequently in this book, Perilous Intimacies, is this category, the Arabic word called mu'alat, Muwalat, mu'alat, which comes from the Arabic word, walid, from the roots waliya, from which we get terms like wali, like the friend of God, a Sufi master, awliya, Sufi saints or friends of God, and so on. And from which we also get terms like wilaya, which can mean, sainthood, can also mean guardianship. So the interesting thing about this category of muwalat, or these related words like wilaya or al-wala or wali, awliya, etc., is that this category also brings together the idea of friendship, friendship with the other, and the idea of political power and political sovereignty. Because ultimately, what wilaya means is the guardianship of a community. I mean, God describes himself as well in Surah Al-Baqarah as the guardian of the faithful, as the wali of the faithful. So this idea of muwalat includes friendship, but also sovereignty, sovereign power. And the idea there is that if you cultivate the good kinds of friendship, which intensify your virtue, then God, the most ultimate sovereign, will gift you with sovereign power. But if you engage in the kind of friendship that is harmful to you and harmful to the community, then your political power will be severely diminished and can even be fully eviscerated. So in this book, I'm interested in the question of looking at this close relationship between friendship and sovereignty. Muwalat as friendship with the other, and muwalat as a relationship of political authority or political dominance over the other. Looking at this, close proximity between the ideas of friendship and sovereignty in Muslim intellectual thought, and also in some ways in Western philosophical thought. But in Western philosophical thought, as I was saying earlier, there is a tension between friendship and sovereignty in that, on the one hand, friendship is a relationship which binds you to the other. It basically connects you, entangles you with the other. You're bound with the friend. But by being entangled with the other, your friend, that also means that you don't have sovereign mastery over yourself. Because if you had sovereign mastery over yourself, you would not need the other. You would not need a relationship of friendship. So the idea of you being bound in a relationship of friendship with the other, in and of itself, is a reminder of the absence of sovereignty over the self. So sovereignty and friendship are in some tension. They have a tense relationship. And similarly, in Islam, friendship and sovereignty are very closely related but it really depends on the kind of friendship that you cultivate. The result of that, the consequences of friendship depend on the kind of friendship that you cultivate, the kind of friendship that elevates your virtues, elevates your behavior, or the kind that will bring harm to you and from you to the rest of the community as well. So, given this close relationship between friendship and sovereignty, both in Muslim intellectual thought and in Western philosophical thought, in different ways, nonetheless, the main question I'm interested in this book, Perilous Intimacies, is that when a Muslim community loses its political sovereignty, which is what happens in South Asia, from the late 18th century onward, especially after 1857, the rebellion of 1857, where Muslims are, brutally defeated by the British, and you have the inauguration, fully consolidated inauguration of British colonialism. So, in this particular moment, when Muslims lose their political sovereignty, how do they reimagine sovereign power? And how does this particular site of Hindu-Muslim friendship or inter-religious friendship become the site for competing articulations of Muslim sovereign power? How should we think about our sovereignty, our sovereign power, in the absence of empire, after empire? That's what the title means, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire. And there are two main arguments that I make in this book. In fact, three main arguments that I make in this book, and I will very briefly mention those arguments, and then I will turn to an example of how that argument actually can be illustrated, and then we will close them. So, three main arguments. Argument number one. My first main argument is that intra-Muslim scholarly debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century became a key site for competing articulations of Muslim sovereign power. So, meaning that no matter what opinion or no matter what view a particular Muslim scholar might have held on the limits of Hindu-Muslim friendship, at stake in their debate was competing articulations of Muslim sovereign power in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. And how that is so, I'll come to that in a moment. But that's the first point, that whatever opinion they may have held, this becomes a key place for the articulation of Muslim sovereign power, the limits of Hindu-Muslim friendship. Argument number two. My other main argument is that, and that's a note on which I began, that intra-Muslim scholarly debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship and the kind of views that are generated through these debates are too complex, are too sophisticated to be approached through such liberal secular binaries like Puritan, pluralist, inclusivist, exclusivist, tolerant, intolerant, liberal, fundamentalist. See, this is one of the most pervasive ways in which Muslims are talked about. Not only in popular culture and not only in Western societies, by the way, Muslim majority societies are a great example. I mean, you can take even the example of Bangladesh. How are people talked about when they talk about Islam and politics, when they, invoke Islam and the rich heritage of Islam for the articulation of the political, for politics, they're oftentimes branded as what? As fundamentalists, as, extremists. So then the state has to intervene and has to regulate their behavior, has to undermine their mixture of the religious and the political, a very thorough liberal secular distinction. So my second main argument is that these debates are too sophisticated to be read through these kinds of liberal secular binaries, which cause a lot of violence not only to the internal sophistication of the tradition, but it also, in today's world, authorizes this intervention of the state in trying to dispel these supposed, transgressions of religion and religious subjects and so on. Third main argument. My third main argument is that as these debates unfold in the context of the loss of Muslim political sovereignty in South Asia, one of the key sort of arenas of life where Muslim scholars increasingly come to articulate some notion of sovereign power is the domain of everyday Muslim ritual life and everyday Muslim ritual practices. So, in other words, when the ulama, South Asian Muslim scholars, traditionally trained, from Muslim seminaries from the madrasas, the ulama, when they realized that resuscitating a Muslim state is no longer possible after 1857, increasingly their efforts turned to regulating Muslim life, especially in relation to non-Muslim subjects in the public sphere, um, through ritual practices like cow sacrifice, the performance of the Eid prayers, and many other ritual practices. That become a key place where Muslim sovereign power, Muslim dominance over the religious other increasingly comes to be located. And the key term there for these Muslim ritual practices that index Muslim distinction over non-Muslims, the key term there is this term called sha'air. So sha'air, basically the singular is shi'ar, an Arabic term, means distinctive markers of Islam. Like those markers of Islam, those external markers of Islam, those external rituals that mark the distinction of Muslims over non-Muslims. So preserving the distinctive markers of Islam became a very important preoccupation among many Muslim scholars. But not all Muslim scholars agreed with this. There were some Muslim scholars who disagreed with locating Muslim sovereign power in ritual practices. And they, for example, argued that no, Muslim sovereign power resides in the idea of the caliphate, which to them was the Ottoman Caliphate, which was under attack at that time from the British state. So again, what we find is competing articulations of Muslim sovereign power, where you have Muslim scholars locating sovereign power in different domains of life, Muslim ritual practices or the idea and the institution of the caliphate. Okay, so this was the broad kind of outline of the purpose of the book, the main theme of the book, and the three main arguments of the book. Now I want to turn in the next 20 minutes or so to a case study, to an illustration of how then this unfolds. I think I've been speaking for 15 minutes, so I'll speak for 20 more minutes and then we can open it up for questions. And for that, I want to turn to a handout that I've sort of prepared for our gathering today. And I'll just keep this up for a minute and explain to you the case study that I want to walk you through now. So the case study I want to talk about, and this is a case study of an intra-Muslim debate, an intra-Muslim disagreement on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship. This case study goes back almost exactly a century. Almost exactly a century ago, in 1920, as many of you would know, there was this famous and really important movement in South Asia called the Caliphate movement or the Khilafat movement, which was closely allied with the non-cooperation movement of Gandhi and the Indian National Congress. And the main argument of the Khilafat movement was that Indian Muslims should collaborate with Gandhi and the Hindu community to put pressure on the British Empire to not attack or to stop its assault on the Ottoman state, which to them was the Ottoman Caliphate. And they wanted to preserve the geographic and the spiritual integrity of the Ottoman Caliphate by putting pressure on the British. So that's how they came together in trying to put pressure on the British. So coming back to the Khilafat movement. So one of the things that, and the Khilafat movement, of course, was populated by different kinds of Muslim scholars. Some of them were the ulama, the seminary-educated Muslim scholars, what we in the Western academy call the traditionalist Muslim scholars, and then others were people who we call the Muslim modernists. And one of the most important people in the Khilafat movement was someone like Abul Kalam Azad, item number 2 on your handout here, who of course was one of the major political leaders and became a key president of the Indian National Congress, the youngest one at the age of 35, I believe, and became the first education minister of India after independence as well. So it had different kinds of scholars. And the interesting thing about the Khilafat movement, and I will now turn to Abul Kalam Azad a bit and his kind of thought, and this I do a very detailed reading of in chapter 3 of the book. The thing that I really want to emphasize is that, today, when we look back at someone like Abul Kalam Azad, and this happens especially among some of what we might call an Indian Muslim liberal kind of elite and crowd, who were trying to find good Muslims from the archive of history, they turned Abul Kalam Azad into some kind of a modernist who was a radical pluralist and so on. And yes, he did argue for Hindu-Muslim friendship in taking on the British. But his arguments, interestingly, were based not on some appeal to an abstract notion of liberal pluralism, but his argument was based on a reading of the Muslim intellectual tradition. And his argument was based on particular readings of specific verses in the Quran. So now let me take you to a couple of verses that he cited in making his case for Hindu-Muslim friendship. So the two main verses that he cited were these two verses from Surah Mumtahana, chapter 60 of the Quran, verses 8 and 9, which broadly God says in those two verses that, and this is item number 3 on your handout, God says that God does not forbid you from showing kindness to those unbelievers who do not fight you on account of your faith and nor drive you forth from your homes. God only forbids you to turn in friendship towards those unbelievers who do these things, fight against you because of your faith, drive you forth from your homes, meaning evict you from your homes, or aid others in driving you forth. Basically making a distinction between aggressive and hostile unbelievers and non-aggressive and non-hostile unbelievers. The first one you can't turn into friendship, but the second one you can, those who are not hostile to you, those who are not aggressive to you. So Abul Kalam Azad's main argument was that in the context of early 20th century India, Hindus were non-Muslims of the variety who were not hostile, who were not aggressive. And the British, because of their aggressive designs against the Ottoman Caliphate, represented Muslims, non-Muslims of the second variety, who were hostile to you, who were aggressive to you, and so on, and hence you cannot turn in friendship towards them. And from that, Abul Kalam Azad made the argument that Indian Muslims should undertake what he called the severance of all civic ties with the British. And the term that he used, I'll just stop share for now and I'll come back to it in a moment, the handout. The term that he used for that is what he called tark-e-muwalat, meaning abandoning muwalat, abandoning all relations of ties of civility and relations with the British. Now, before I get to the opposing viewpoint to someone like Abul Kalam Azad, I want to actually turn to a very specific case study, even within the Khilafat movement, a specific case study of how this kind of debate unfolded. And that case study I want to turn to relates to the question of cow sacrifice. Sacrificing the cow both on the occasion of Eid al-Adha and also sacrificing the cows in general in daily life of Muslims. And this was a topic of tremendous debate in the Indian public sphere. By the early 20th century, the British Army becomes the biggest consumers of beef in South Asia, which is why they're quite sympathetic to the argument that it should not be banned. But this is also the time where you have the emergence of these Hindu reform movements like the Arya Samaj, led by Pandit Dayananda Saraswati. And they start establishing these things called the cow protection groups all over North India, especially, and in Punjab. And so just to show you the kind of effect of this kind of public sphere, let me share another image with you right now. And this image comes from, this image comes from the, I think the 1876 issue of this famous magazine called the Awadh Punch, which was built around or run on the model of the London magazine called Punch. And basically what we see here is that you have a group of Hindu pundits and then you have a group of Muslim butchers pulling the cow in either direction. And in the right above it, you have the word ta'assub, meaning bigotry. So basically showing that this became a major problem of competing brands of bigotry and so on. So anyways, now let me come to the main kind of point here, the argument here. The opposing viewpoint to Ahmad Raza Khan, to Abul Kalam Azad, was most forcefully articulated by this Muslim scholar called Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, who died in 1921. who was the founder of the famous Bareilly school in South Asia, formed in, of course, the town of Bareilly in northern India. And that's where Ahmad Raza Khan was from. And Ahmad Raza Khan became one of the major scholars who critiqued the Khilafat movement and its scholars. And interestingly, Ahmad Raza Khan's critique, his opposing viewpoint, was also based on the Quran. So he went back to those same two verses of Surah Mumtahana, verses 8 and 9. And he made the argument that no, you cannot make the distinction between, non-Muslims who are not hostile to you and those who are hostile to you, and map it onto the difference between Hindus and the British. And he basically said that, look, go to any Hindu-dominated town, village, and district, and try sacrificing a cow, and then see what happens to you. See if they don't break your bones. So his main argument was that this empirically is not valid. This is not true that Hindus are a community who are not hostile to Muslims. To which people like Abul Kalam Azad counter-argued and said, look, there can be some Hindus in some places who do these kinds of things, but in general, the community is not aggressive towards us. So Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan's response to that was that, well, in that case, all British are also not opposed to the Ottoman state, and all British also don't, undermine your political identity and agency. It's only some in the state who do that. So your argument also does not hold. But Ahmad Raza Khan's broader argument, where I want to turn to here, was concentrated on preserving Muslim markers of distinction like cow sacrifice in the public sphere. Because one of the main arguments of the Khilafat movement leaders like Abul Kalam Azad and others was that because of the Hindu sensitivity associated with the cow, Muslims should not sacrifice cows, especially on occasions like Eid al-Adha. And they had argued that, look, there are other animals that you can sacrifice, like goats and sheep and so on. And the argument of the Khilafat movement leaders, again, was based on a very specific reading of the Islamic legal tradition, the Sharia. And their main argument was that, look, cows or sacrificing cows in the Sharia is not an obligation, is not wajib, it's not obligatory, it's simply permissible. This category in Islamic law called mubah. Mubah basically is a practice which is neither obligatory nor forbidden, but it's just simply permissible. You can do it if you want. If you don't want to do it, you don't do it. It's simply permissible. Human beings have the agency whether to do those things or to not do those things. So the Khilafat movement leaders had argued that, look, cow sacrifice is only a mubah practice, and abandoning it would not constitute any theological or normative problems for Indian Muslims. So Ahmad Raza Khan then, in trying to oppose that viewpoint, counter-argued, and I'll just turn back to the handout here. He counter-argued in a text that was titled, item number 5 on your handout, The Finest Viewpoint on Cow Sacrifice, Anfus al-Fikr fi Qurban al-Baqr, published in 1880. This is a substantial text in Urdu and Arabic combined, where Ahmad Raza Khan basically makes the argument, and now I want to walk you through his argument somewhat gradually so that you can follow the trajectory of his argument. Ahmad Raza Khan's main argument was this. He said that, yes, in general, cow sacrifice is simply permissible. But in the specific context of South Asia, cow sacrifice is a practice which is a distinctive marker of Muslim identity in the public sphere. Sacrificing cows is an external practice through which the distinction of Muslims in relation to non-Muslim communities is visualized, is established. In other words, cow sacrifice is what he called a shi'ar, plural sha'air of Islam, public markers of Muslim distinction. And he basically argued that if you abandon a marker of Muslim distinction under the pressure or under the coercion of Gandhi, the Indian National Congress, or the Hindu community more broadly, or if you are even perceived to be abandoning a marker of Muslim distinction under the pressure or coercion of Gandhi or the Hindu community, that would undermine among the central purposes of the Sharia, which is preserving the markers of Muslim distinction, because it is the markers of Muslim distinction that make possible Muslim sovereign power, which is the one of the underlying purposes of the Sharia, establishing Muslim sovereign power over non-Muslims. So that was his main argument. And then he also cited, for example, verses in the Quran, such as verse number 36 of chapter 22, item number 7 on your handout, which says, "As for the sacrifice of cattle, we have ordained it for you as among the symbols of distinction designated by God. وَالْبُدْنَ جَعَلْنَاهَا لَكُم مِّن شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ." We have ordained it for you as markers of Muslim distinction. So the thing that I want us to notice here is how a scholar like Ahmad Raza Khan, in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty, in the absence of a Muslim political state, is investing the promise of sovereign power in the everyday ritual practice of the Muslim community, in these markers of distinction like cow sacrifice. Now, what was the opposing argument to this? To this argument of Ahmad Raza Khan? And on that note, I will end my case study. The opposing argument was given, I think the most sophisticated example of the opposing argument was given by this really interesting and fascinating South Asian Muslim scholar, a really important, person of our heritage called Maulvi Abdul Bari, item number 8 on your handout, who died in 1926. And he was one of the luminaries, a major scholar of the rationalist Farangi Mahal school, which is known for its expertise in what are called the rationalist disciplines in Islam, the maqulat of Islam. And Abdul Bari was a major scholar of the Khilafat movement and a very close ally of Gandhi as well. Now, Abdul Bari, interestingly, is a traditionalist scholar. He went to a seminary. He has the whole education of, seminary education. In fact, he's from the Farangi Mahal school, from which we get, the scholar Mullah Nizamuddin, from which we get the main curriculum of madrasas in South Asia, the Dars-e Nizami, as it is called. So it really comes from the Farangi Mahal school in some ways. So he's a really important traditionalist scholar and alim, as compared to Abul Kalam Azad, who knew his Quran, who knew his fiqh or jurisprudence and so on, but he is not quite as much of a traditionalist as an Abdul Bari. So Abdul Bari, what was his counter argument? Interestingly, Abdul Bari's counter argument was also drawing on the idea of Shi'ar Islam or Sha'air Islam. And he completely agreed with Ahmad Raza Khan that yes, Indian Muslims must not abandon cow sacrifice under the pressure or under the coercion of Gandhi or the Indian National Congress. Abdul Bari even went to the extent of saying that if Gandhi pressured me to abandon cow sacrifice, I will never do so. And he even said that if Hindus insist on abandoning cow sacrifice, then cow sacrifice, in fact, will become obligatory for us because we cannot come under their pressure or coercion. So he understood the sensitivity towards maintaining Muslim sovereign power, which is among the major goals of the Sharia. But Abdul Bari's argument was this. He argued that, look, yes, Indian Muslims must maintain their marker of Muslim distinction, but he said, what is the more important marker of Muslim distinction than the caliphate, which today for him is the Ottoman Caliphate, in 1920, that is. So he said that this is a moment of political tribulation for Indian Muslims, a moment of political difficulty. And if we ally with Hindus by seizing cow sacrifice and sacrificing other animals, we will be able to restore the Ottoman Caliphate. And then he said, and I'm quoting him, he said, what is the cow when put next to the Caliphate? So his main argument was, now notice the logic of his argument. He's completely agreeing that, yes, don't come under the pressure or coercion of Hindus. But his main argument was that in a moment of political difficulty and tribulation for Indian Muslims, seizing cow sacrifice makes available a much more important, a much more coveted marker of Muslim distinction, which is the caliphate. And that is why we should do this. So in conclusion, let me now conclude things to bring back to what is the main point of what we've talked about in this session. And I'll just take 2 minutes here. I want to make 2 points to conclude. First, notice that the argument that with which I had begun my talk earlier, that in this debate over Hindu-Muslim friendship, in the context of the Khilafat movement, and this debate about the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship, there are two competing views of Muslim sovereign power which are being articulated in a moment which is defined by the loss of Muslim political sovereignty. For someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, Muslim sovereign power was located in the domain of everyday ritual practices like cow sacrifice, these markers of Muslim distinction in everyday ritual practices. For someone like Maulvi Abdul Bari or Abul Kalam Azad, yes, everyday practices were important, but their importance paled in comparison to what they thought was the main fulcrum of Muslim sovereign power, which was the caliphate. So that's point number one. Two competing views of Muslim sovereign power in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. Now, second argument. Notice, and this is a very critical point, and I think this might be of some use to your role as public educators and as students and scholars in Bangladesh today. That notice that in this debate, the competing views that we see being articulated, they cannot be approached through the binary of the inclusivist or the exclusivist, the Puritan and the pluralist. Because let me give you a couple of examples why that is not so. So on the surface, you might look at this debate and say, Abul Kalam Azad and Maulvi Abdul Bari are the inclusivists. They want Hindu-Muslim friendship. And Ahmad Raza Khan is the exclusivist. But the problem with that kind of a framing would be that, for example, Abul Kalam Azad, in fact, argued that launching jihad against the British state is an individual obligation for all Indian Muslims because the British state has gone after the caliphate. So when the British state has gone after the caliphate, Indian Muslims have to decide whether they want to be good Muslims or good citizens of the British Empire. And in that situation, because the caliphate has been attacked, it was an obligation for Indian Muslims to engage in jihad against the British. And he used the category of an individual obligation, fard ain, as it is called in Islamic law. So you have the so-called inclusivist, the modernist, who's calling for jihad. And it was Ahmad Raza Khan who said, look, this is a really foolish idea. You cannot take on the British. You will get further destroyed. Already after 1857, your socioeconomic and political position is quite weakened. So you don't do that. And he said that, in fact, this would be throwing yourself on the path of destruction. And he actually quoted a part of a verse of the Quran, which says that don't with your own hands throw yourself on the path of destruction. لا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة. This is from the Quran. So that's what he said, Ahmad Raza Khan, the so-called exclusivist, that you don't engage in this kind of foolhardiness. And he, in fact, made a very curious argument. So basically, the question emerged: how should Indian Muslims engage with the British? And his main argument was, Ahmad Raza Khan's, that they should engage in what he called masked friendship. Masked friendship, by that he means that, look, take their funding for Muslim schools and colleges, work in British bureaucracy and machinery. Don't weaken yourself socioeconomically to the point of you getting destroyed, because that is what Gandhi wants, according to Ahmad Raza Khan. But engage in a masked friendship, in which you are only dealing with the British on mere transactional relations, what he called mujarrad muamalat, mere transactional relations like taking funding, employment, and so on. So the point being that these scholars and these thinkers are much, much more complicated than what these liberal secular binaries that compartmentalize Muslim life and scholars would have us believe. I'll stop there, and there's a few more points that might come up in the Q&A, and I really, really want to thank you and appreciate you for your patience in listening to me today. Thank you so much to all of you.